So I wondered if you could speak to some of the pre-Christ resurrection myths in other cultures and their similarities and parallels.
And what myths are you thinking of here?
I mean, just like all of them. There are a ton. A lot of people will, point to these as saying that there may have been some influence or
Okay.
some inspiration there.
Yes. In the late 19th century and on into the early 20th, there was a school of thought within German New Testament scholarship called the Religionsgeschichtliche Schule, which meant the history of religions school. And what these scholars did was ransack the literature of ancient mythology, pagan religion, trying to find parallels to Christian beliefs, including the resurrection. And in some cases, they tried to actually explain the origin of these Christian beliefs through the influence of pagan mythology and resurrection. You still find this sort of stuff repeated on the internet by people like Bill Maher and the Zeitgeist movie and so forth. What they don't realize is that this is over 100 years out of date. The old history of religion school collapsed in the early 20th century and is no longer taken seriously by New Testament scholars, principally for two reasons. Number one, it turned out that the supposed parallels were spurious. When you examine these so-called myths of dying and rising gods, like Adonis and Osiris and Tammuz and so forth, it turns out that they really don't concern coming back to earthly life at all. For example, Osiris lives on in the underground world, in the nether realm of the dead. Or in other cases, these are just symbolic ways of portraying the vegetation cycle, the crop cycle, as the vegetation dies in the dry season and comes back in the rainy season. In no case does it have anything to do with a historical, individual, or actual resurrection from the dead. So that when you do this kind of comparative religious work, it is extremely important that one be sensitive to the nuances and the details. And it turns out that there really are, outside of Judaism, nothing in pagan mythology that is truly parallel to Jewish belief in the resurrection of the dead. The second reason it collapsed was not only were the parallels spurious, but there was no causal connection between those myths and early Christian beliefs. Jews were familiar with these pagan beliefs and they found them abhorrent. And so there is no trace in first century Palestine of cults of dying and rising gods. And in any case, it would simply be unthinkable that people like Peter and James, the disciples of Jesus, would actually come to believe this un-Jewish and outlandish idea that Jesus of Nazareth was risen from the dead because they had heard stories of Hercules or Osiris or something of that sort. So that the causal link is simply missing. And so pagan mythology has ceased to be actually a relevant category in the interpretation of the historical Jesus today. What has happened is what some scholars have called the Jewish reclamation of Jesus. That is to say, scholars have rediscovered the Jewishness of Jesus. Jesus and all the disciples were Jews. And it is against the backdrop of first century Judaism that Jesus and the Gospels are to be understood, not against the background of pagan mythology. And you might have wondered, how could so obvious a fact have ever been missed by scholars? Well, I was talking to James Crossley, who is a New Testament scholar at Sheffield University in England and not a conservative by any means. And I said to him, how could New Testament scholars have been so derailed as to have missed the Jewishness of Jesus? And he said, it was anti-Semitism, German anti-Semitism. And that just hit me. I thought, wow, it is true that German theology for decades has led the way in historical Jesus and New Testament studies. And the same anti-Semitism in German culture that eventually led to the Second World War, he thinks, colored historical Jesus studies so that Jesus needed to be seen as an Aryan. It was unthinkable that he could have been a real Jew. And what has happened now with the Jewish reclamation of Jesus is that people are reading the Gospels against the background of first century Jewish thought. And when you do that, as I've said, then the Gospels come out looking very good as historical sources for the life of this first century Jew.